The day Kenneth Archer got fired, he was holding a mop. Not because he was careless, not because he said something wrong or showed up late or cut corners on the job. He was fired because he picked up a pencil that wasn't his and drew something on a napkin that someone with a business degree and a corner office decided was above his station. That's the part nobody tells you about working maintenance at a place like Meridian Architecture Group. You learn the building better than anyone. The lights that flicker on the third floor, the HVAC vent that rattles every time the temperature drops below 10 degrees, the way the glass in the East Conference Room fogs up on humid mornings. You know every corner of that place. But the moment you step outside the invisible line they've drawn around you, you become a problem to be solved. Kenneth had been at Meridian for 3 years. Before that, he'd spent 11 years as a senior draftsman at a mid-size firm in Winnipeg called Holloway & Crane, doing technical drawings for commercial builds, distribution centers, municipal libraries, a regional hospital wing he was particularly proud of. He'd gone to NAIT at 19, got his drafting certificate, worked his way up. He was good at it, not just competent, genuinely good. The kind of good that colleagues noticed and managers quietly depended on. Then his wife, Diane, got sick, the kind of sick that doesn't announce itself politely. Pancreatic cancer, stage 3, diagnosed on a Thursday in February when their son Noah was 8 years old. What followed were 14 months of treatments, drives to the cancer center, Noah sleeping in hospital waiting rooms wrapped in Kenneth's jacket, and Kenneth burning through every sick day, every vacation day, every favor he had with every manager he'd ever worked for. Holloway & Crane held his position for 6 months. After that, they didn't. By the time Diane passed, Kenneth had a 9-year-old son, a mortgage he was already behind on, and a resume gap that, in his industry, was the kind of thing that made recruiters glance at the page and move on. He took the maintenance job at Meridian because it paid steadily, because the hours allowed him to get Noah to school and pick him up after, and because, and he never said this out loud to anyone, being inside an architecture firm, even with a mop in his hand, felt like the closest thing to what he used to be. He'd walk past the drafting stations in the evening after everyone had gone home and look at the drawings pinned to the boards. Sometimes he'd stand there longer than he should have. He never touched anything, not for 3 years, until the night of the Belcourt bid. Meridian had been chasing the Belcourt Commons contract for 8 months, a mixed-use development in Ottawa's West End, 12 stories, retail on the ground floor, residential above, a rooftop green space that the developer, a man named Theodore Vance, had been publicly vocal about wanting done right. It was the kind of project that could anchor a firm's next decade, the kind of project that made partners nervous and junior staff pull all-nighters. The lead on the Belcourt bid was a woman named Sandra Keel. She'd made partner 2 years earlier, at 34, which the firm's internal newsletter had celebrated as a milestone. Sandra ran her team the way certain people run things when they've worked very hard to get somewhere and are quietly terrified of losing it, with precision, with impatience, and with very little tolerance for anything that felt like interference. Kenneth had no particular feeling about Sandra one way or another. She was polite enough when they passed in the hallway. She occasionally left her coffee cups near the sink instead of in it, which mattered more to him practically than anything else about her. The night it happened was a Tuesday in late October. Kenneth was finishing his rounds on the 4th floor, the design studio where the Belcourt team had been camped for weeks. Most of them had gone home by 8. The lights in the main studio were on the motion sensor setting, cycling off every 20 minutes unless someone moved. He came in with his cart and noticed right away that something was off on the center drafting table. Not the mess, there was always a mess by this point in a project cycle. What he noticed was the elevation drawing spread across the surface, the one depicting the building's main facade, and the specific problem with it that had nothing to do with his job and everything to do with 11 years of staring at drawings just like it. The proportional relationship between the ground floor retail windows and the residential floors above was wrong. Not aesthetically wrong, structurally communicative wrong. The glazing ratio on the ground floor signaled a different building language than the upper floors. It would read, to anyone who looked at it carefully, as 2 different buildings stacked on top of each other. More practically, the way the rhythm was drawn would make the rooftop green space, Vance's signature look like an afterthought rather than an intention. Kenneth stood there for a long moment. He knew what the correction was. He'd seen a similar problem resolved at Holloway & Crane on the Selkirk Avenue Library project, where a colleague named Patrice had caught it during a 3rd-round review and saved them from an embarrassing presentation. The fix wasn't complicated. It required adjusting the window module by about 15% and redistributing the rhythm across the facade so the building read as a unified composition from street level. He also knew it was none of his business. He picked up his mop. He started on the far corner of the studio. And then he stopped because on the edge of the drafting table, next to a cold cup of coffee and a pile of redline markups, there was a soft lead pencil and a yellow legal pad. He told himself he was just going to write a note. Something simple. There may be a proportional issue with the ground floor glazing, K. Leave it where someone would find it in the morning. Anonymous enough to be dismissed, specific enough to be useful if anyone bothered to check. He picked up the pencil. And then, because he hadn't touched a drafting pencil in 3 years and because his hands remembered things his brain was trying to forget, he started to sketch. It was supposed to be a quick diagram. It turned into something else. 35 minutes later, he had a full corrected elevation sketch on 3 sheets of the legal pad, annotated, dimensioned at rough scale, with notes in the margins explaining the proportional logic. It was the clearest thinking he'd done in years. His hand was steady. His mind was quiet in a way it almost never was anymore. He folded the sheets and set them carefully on top of the original drawing where they couldn't be missed. Then he finished mopping, emptied the wastebaskets, turned off the lights and went home to relieve his neighbor, Patricia Chu, who watched Noah on his late nights. He did not think about it again until Sandra Keel walked into the maintenance room at 7:45 the following morning with the legal pad sheets in her hand and her expression arranged in a way that told him the conversation was not going to go well. "Did you do this?" she asked. There was no point in denying it. His handwriting was distinct, block letters with a slight leftward lean, the way his drafting instructor at NATE had drilled into him back when he was 19 and thought precision in lettering was the most important skill in the world. "I noticed something in the drawing," he said. "I thought it might be worth flagging." Sandra looked at him for a long moment. "Your maintenance, I know. You went through the project materials on the Belcourt bid. The drawing was on the table. I didn't go through anything. I saw something. You drew on my team's work. I drew on a legal pad. I didn't touch the drawing." Her expression didn't shift. "I'm going to need you to come to HR," he went. He sat across from a woman named Colleen Marsh in a beige office on the 2nd floor while Sandra stood near the window and explained that a maintenance employee had entered the design studio outside of supervised hours and had interfered with confidential project materials. Colleen Marsh looked genuinely uncomfortable, which Kenneth appreciated as a human response even if it didn't change anything. He was let go by 8:30. Colleen handed him a manila envelope with his final pay stub, his record of employment, and a letter explaining that his position was being terminated due to a breach of the firm's confidentiality and professional conduct policy. She told him he could return for his personal belongings during business hours. He took the bus home. He sat in the kitchen for a while without turning the lights on. Then he called Patricia Chu and asked if she could get Noah from school that afternoon. What Kenneth didn't know, what no one outside of Sandra's team knew, was that the Belcourt drawings had a problem that went considerably further than a proportional error in the facade elevation. Meridian had brought in a contract designer named Bradley Sutton 8 months earlier to lead the conceptual phase of the Belcourt bid. Bradley had a portfolio that read impressively: an award shortlisted community center in Saskatoon, a residential complex in Halifax that had gotten some press attention, and he'd pitched the Belcourt concept with enough confidence that Sandra had felt comfortable letting him run. When Bradley left the project at the 6-month mark citing creative differences with the client direction, he'd handed off a package of drawings that everyone assumed was complete. It wasn't. What Bradley had actually done was deliver a concept that was visually compelling at the presentation scale and structurally incoherent at the development scale. The facade proportioning issue Kenneth had spotted was the most visible symptom, but underneath it, the entire technical basis for the rooftop green space, its structural load distribution, its integration with the residential floors below, was built on assumptions that didn't survive contact with the building code. Sandra's team had been working from Bradley's package without fully interrogating it, because they trusted the original concept and because they were already behind on the submission timeline. This became apparent on a Wednesday afternoon, 4 days after Kenneth was fired, when a structural engineer named Paul Devereaux at a consulting firm called Lakeridge Technical flagged the green space loading assumptions in a routine third-party review. He sent a memo. The memo created a problem. The problem was that the submission deadline for the Belcourt bid was 9 days away, and the drawings the firm was planning to submit had a foundational error in them that would be apparent to any technically competent reviewer on Theodore Vance's side. Sandra's team spent the rest of Wednesday and most of Thursday trying to solve it. They couldn't, not cleanly, not in the time available. The problem wasn't the structural calculation alone. It was that fixing the structural logic required revisiting the facade composition, which brought them back, directly, to the proportional issue that Kenneth had identified on the legal pad. One of the junior designers on Sandra's team, a recent grad from Dalhousie named Petra Hollis, had actually looked at Kenneth's sketch the morning after he left it. She'd seen what he'd done, she'd pulled up the original and compared them. And she'd quietly told her colleague, a man named Ray Chen, that whoever had drawn those corrections knew what they were doing. Ray hadn't thought much of it at the time. On Thursday evening, with Petra's voice in the back of his head and the deadline getting closer, he looked up the maintenance staff records. He found Kenneth Archer's name, he found the note in the HR file confirming the termination. He also found, because Meridian's internal records were less carefully compartmentalized than they should have been, a copy of Kenneth's resume from his original employment application, the one that listed Holloway and Crane, 11 years of technical drafting, knee 8 and the projects. Ray put the resume on Sandra's desk at 7 o'clock Thursday evening without saying anything. She called Kenneth at 8:15. He was sitting at the kitchen table helping Noah with a social studies assignment about the provinces and territories. Noah was trying to remember which provinces had the most fresh water. Kenneth's phone buzzed. He didn't recognize the number. He answered it anyway. "Mr. Archer," Sandra said. "This is Sandra Keel from Meridian." He said nothing. "I'd like to meet with you tomorrow morning," she said, "to discuss the Belcourt project." "I don't work there anymore," he said. "I know." A pause. "I'd still like to meet." He looked at Noah, who was staring at a map of Canada with the focused expression of a child who had decided he was going to memorize every square kilometer of the country through sheer willpower. "I'll think about it," Kenneth said, and ended the call. He did think about it. For most of that night, in fact. He lay in the dark after Noah was asleep and went through it carefully the way he used to approach problems at the drafting table, not from the emotional center of the thing but from the outside edge, methodically. He was angry. That was real. The anger wasn't spectacular or self-dramatizing. It was the quiet, dry kind that settles in after something unfair happens and you've had enough time to stop being shocked by it. He'd tried to help and been punished for it, and nothing about that had changed just because Sandra Keel was calling him on a Thursday night. But he also knew what the Belcourt project meant, not to Meridian in the abstract. He didn't particularly care about the firm's business interests, but to the building itself. Mixed-use residential in Ottawa's West End, a rooftop green space that a developer had publicly committed to. If the bid submission was flawed and the project stalled or got awarded to another firm on the basis of a cleaner package, the building that eventually got built might not have that green space, might not read the way a building at that corner of the city could read. That was the part that bothered him, not the firm, the building. He agreed to meet. He took the bus to Meridian the next morning. He still had his transit pass, hadn't bothered to think about it expiring, and felt strange walking in through the front entrance instead of the loading bay. The receptionist looked at him with a brief uncertainty that told him she recognized his face but couldn't immediately place where from. Sandra met him in a small meeting room on the 3rd floor, not the partner's office he'd half expected. Ray Chen was there, and Petra Hollis, and a man he didn't know who turned out to be the firm's managing partner, a soft-spoken man in his early 60s named Gordon, not the Gordon on his list, a different one, who shook Kenneth's hand and said he appreciated him coming in. Sandra was composed. She sat across from him and placed the legal pad sketches on the table between them. "You identified the proportional problem in the facade elevation," she said. It wasn't quite an acknowledgement, but it wasn't a denial either. "Our structural consultant flagged a related issue with the green space loading. The two problems connect." "I know they connect," Kenneth said. She looked at him. "You saw the loading issue too, not from the drawing. But if the facade rhythm is wrong, the compositional logic for the rooftop is compromised. Anyone who reads the drawing that way is going to pull the green space plan and look at it harder." He paused. "Which your structural consultant did." There was a short silence. "We have 9 days to the submission deadline," Sandra said. 8, Ray said quietly. 8 days, Sandra said. "I'd like to know if you'd be willing to work with the team on correcting the package." Kenneth looked at the sketches on the table. They were his handwriting, his proportional logic, his 11 years of knowing what a building wanted to say and how to make the drawings say it. "What happened to Bradley Sutton's work?" he asked. Sandra didn't answer immediately, which was itself an answer. "He delivered an incomplete package," Ray said. "We didn't catch it until too late." "You didn't catch it," Kenneth said. "I caught it. I caught it with a pencil and a legal pad after everyone else had gone home, and you fired me for it." No one in the room said anything. "I want that on the table," Kenneth said. "Not as a grievance. Just as a fact we're all acknowledging before we talk about anything else." Sandra looked at him for a long moment. "You're right," she said. "What happened was wrong. I made a decision quickly and I was wrong to make it." He hadn't expected that. He'd expected deflection or a legalistic framing or some version of "we have protocols for a reason." He hadn't expected her to say it plainly. Okay, he said. They spent the next 6 hours in that meeting room and then moved to the design studio and then spread out across 2 tables. Kenneth worked through the facade proportioning first, translating the legal pad sketches into a clean set of corrected drawings with Petra, who turned out to have good spatial instincts and a quick, accurate hand. Ray handled the coordination between the facade revision and the structural package, running line-by-line comparisons against the Lakeridge technical memo. At some point someone ordered food. Kenneth ate a sandwich without noticing what kind it was. What emerged over those hours wasn't just a corrected set of drawings. The proportional revision changed the way the facade read from the ground floor up, and that change made the rooftop green space legible in a way it hadn't been before. Not as something bolted to the top of a residential building, but as the building's actual conclusion, the visual weight it was carrying toward. The structural logic followed from that. The loading assumptions, once the compositional intent was clear, resolved more cleanly than Paul Devereaux's memo had suggested they would. Petra looked at the revised elevation pinned to the board at around 9 that evening and said quietly, "That's a better building." Kenneth didn't say anything, but it was true. He went home that night knowing he still didn't have a job. The agreement for the day had been informal. Sandra had said they'd discuss terms after the meeting, and then the meeting had turned into 6 hours of drawing, and no one had circled back to terms. That was fine. He was tired. He thought about it on the bus and decided he wasn't in a rush. Noah was asleep when he got home. Patricia had stayed, as she sometimes did when Kenneth's days ran long, and she was sitting in the living room reading. She looked at him when he came in. "You look different," she said. Different how? She thought about it. Less like someone who's just getting through the day. He made tea. He sat at the kitchen table and looked at Noah's social studies notes still spread across one side of the table. The provinces and territories, their capitals, their freshwater, the things that define them geographically. He'd thought after Diane died that the part of him that cared about buildings, not just about the job but about the actual thinking of it, the compositional logic, the question of what a building was trying to say, was gone. Too expensive a thing to keep caring about when there were more immediate things that needed his attention. He'd set it down and walked away from it and told himself it was fine. Turns out it wasn't gone. It had just been waiting in his hands. Sandra called him Monday morning. The Belcourt submission had gone in on time Friday evening. She wanted to meet again. This time she offered him a contract position, 12 months initially, project-based, with the Belcourt build as the anchor work if the firm won the bid. The rate was considerably more than what he'd been making in maintenance. Not what he would have earned at his Holloway and Crane level before everything fell apart, but closer than he'd expected. He asked for 2 things. The first was a title that reflected the work he was actually doing, not draughting assistant or contract technical support. Design associate was the language he used. Sandra agreed without argument. The second was flexible start times on school days. She agreed to that too. He signed the contract on a Tuesday. He told Noah that night at dinner. Noah asked if it meant they could fix the crack in the driveway, which had been bothering him since spring. Kenneth said probably yes. Noah seemed satisfied with that answer and went back to his pasta. The Belcourt contract was awarded to Meridian 11 weeks later. Theodore Vance sent a letter to the firm singling out the facade composition and the rooftop integration as the elements that distinguished the submission. Sandra forwarded the letter to Kenneth with a short note attached. "This is yours." He pinned it to the wall above his desk, not the desk in the maintenance room. The desk in the design studio, in the corner by the east-facing window where the morning light came in clean and clear, the same window where the glass fogged on humid days and he used to wipe it down with a cloth and move on. He still knew where the flickering light was on the 3rd floor. He'd mentioned it to the new maintenance lead, a man named Curtis, on his first week back in the building proper. Curtis had fixed it within the day. Kenneth watched the Belcourt Commons building go up over the following 2 years. He drove past the site sometimes on weekends with Noah, who had developed an opinion about the construction timeline and expressed it freely. The rooftop green space opened in early June. There was a small public event, the developer, the city councilor for the ward, a few dozen people standing on a rooftop in the afternoon sun. Kenneth wasn't invited officially. He hadn't expected to be. He went anyway because the building was open to the public and it was a Saturday and Noah wanted to see the rooftop. And you didn't need an invitation to stand on a rooftop and look at a city you'd always lived in from an angle you'd never quite had before. They stood at the north edge and Noah pointed out landmarks. The river, the older buildings downtown, a construction crane 2 blocks east that he'd been tracking for months. The proportions were right. From street level, from up here, from every angle Kenneth had been thinking about since the night he picked up that pencil. The building read as one thing, a unified thing, speaking in a consistent language from the ground floor to the green space where they were standing. That was what he'd been trying to say with those legal pad sketches. That was what the building had been trying to say all along. He stood there in the afternoon light with his son beside him and let himself feel it, not the vindication, not the sequence of events that had brought him here, but just the building itself, doing what a good building does, holding its ground quietly, asking nothing more than to be read correctly by whoever takes the time to look.